At 71 years old, Evelyn Hayes woke up in a sterile hospital bed to find her life had been liquidated by the children she raised. But what her greedy heirs didn't know, what they were too impatient to understand, was that the true deed was never in the house they sold. The real power rested in a rotting tidal mill they threw away. If you've ever had your trust weaponized against you by your own blood, if you've ever been treated like a burden when you were the foundation, if you've ever been stripped of everything just when you needed care the most, this story is for you. Subscribe now, because what Evelyn uncovered in that sinking cottage will prove that greed always digs its own grave. Evelyn had built her life on a quiet, steady devotion. She walked away from her accounting degree 3 semesters before graduation. Her husband needed someone to manage his contracting ledger. She closed her textbooks that night and never opened them again. For 30 years she ran his entire billing department from a small desk in the hallway. She never drew a single paycheck. When her son David started his logistics company, she took her mother's diamond wedding ring to a jeweler downtown. She handed him the cash in a plain manila envelope. She told him it was a standard bank loan. She drained her independent retirement account to pay the caterers for her daughter Sarah's out-of-state wedding. She smiled in all the photographs. She wore a dress she had owned for 8 years. When her husband's heart failed, she spent 10 years as his full-time caregiver. She lifted him from the bed to the wheelchair. She measured liquid medications at 3 in the morning. She slept in a vinyl chair beside him until the morning he didn't wake up. The hospital room smelled of rubbing alcohol and bleached cotton. Rain lashed against the single square window. Evelyn took shallow, careful breaths, wincing as the hospital gown brushed against her chest. She was supposed to return to the large colonial house to recover. Instead, she woke up to the rhythmic beeping of cardiac monitors. Her 2 children stood at the foot of her bed. Sarah held a thin cardboard box. David stood near the window. He had his phone out and was scrolling through a luxury car website. He didn't look up when the nurse came in to adjust Evelyn's IV drip. He didn't ask the doctor about the surgical recovery timeline. He just kept scrolling. His thumb flicked across the glass screen while his mother struggled to sit up. Sarah placed the cardboard box on the rolling tray table. Inside rested her leather wallet, a ceramic mug, and a heavy silver monogrammed letter opener. Evelyn knew exactly what was in the wallet. $41.16 in faded bills and loose coins. The letter opener had belonged to Evelyn's father. The silver was tarnished black deep inside the engraved initials. Evelyn reached out with a trembling hand and touched the cold metal. It was the only piece of her father's study they had packed. "We had to move quickly, Mum," Sarah said. She adjusted the leather strap of her designer handbag. The market was peaking. The house was just too much for you to manage anyway. Evelyn looked at the box. While she was unconscious under general anesthesia, they had used a medical power of attorney. They listed and sold the colonial home. They emptied 40 years of her life into estate sale dumpsters. They deposited the proceeds into an account she could no longer access. The colonial home to David and Sarah, the joint bank accounts to David and Sarah, the antique furniture to David and Sarah. While they adjusted their designer bags and checked their luxury watches, Evelyn received what they called a clean break, a rusty iron key to a crumbling tidal mill. David finally locked his phone and put it in his pocket. "We're worried about you, Mum," he said. "At your age, you can't manage a property like that alone. We're just being realistic." He stepped forward and placed the rusty iron key next to the silver letter opener. "We kept the old tidal mill property for you," Sarah added. "It's a clean break, Mum. It's what you always said you wanted, peace and quiet." The tidal mill was a rotting wooden structure on the edge of the county estuary. Her father had purchased it 50 years ago. He intended to restore it. He never did. It had sat empty for 4 decades. The roof was caving in. The county had deemed it unbuildable and legally worthless. That was why David and Sarah hadn't bothered to sell it. Evelyn looked at the rusty key. She picked up the silver letter opener. She gripped the handle until her knuckles turned white. The heavy metal pressed firmly against her palm. "When am I being discharged?" she asked. The nurse paused by the door. David blinked, staring at his mother. "Tomorrow morning," Sarah said quickly. "We'll have a cab waiting for you." They didn't offer to drive her. They didn't offer to carry the cardboard box. They walked out of the sterile hospital room together. Evelyn sat alone, listening to the steady beep of the monitor. She picked up the rusty key. She slipped it into the pocket of her gown alongside the silver letter opener. The room was completely silent. She did not cry. The automatic hospital doors slid open with a quiet mechanical hum. Evelyn stepped onto the concrete drop-off lane. The morning air was damp and heavy with salt from the coast. A yellow cab idled at the curb. The driver did not get out to open the door. She climbed into the back seat. She placed the thin cardboard box on her lap. She gave the driver the address on the old estuary road. The drive took 45 minutes. She watched the city blur past the smudged window glass. The large colonial houses of her old neighborhood gave way to strip malls. The strip malls faded into industrial parks. Then the paved road turned to packed dirt and crushed white shells. They drove deep into the forgotten coastal marshlands. The cab stopped at the end of a long, overgrown driveway. "That's $32, the driver said. He did not look back at her in the rearview mirror. Evelyn opened her worn leather wallet. She pulled out a 20, a 10, and 2 crumpled $1 bills. She handed the cash over the seat. She stepped out onto the damp gravel. She looked down into the folds of her wallet. She counted the remaining faded bills and the loose silver coins. She had exactly $41.16 left in the world. The cab reversed quickly down the driveway. The tires threw small wet rocks into the tall marsh grass. The red taillights disappeared around the bend in the road. Evelyn stood completely still. The silence of the estuary was immediate and heavy. It was not a peaceful silence. It was the specific, damp quiet of total abandonment. The tidal mill sat 50 yards away, built directly over the dark water. The structure leaned slightly toward the left. The roof sagged deep in the center. Dark green moss covered the remaining wooden shingles. Several windows were completely shattered. The wood siding was stripped bare and gray by decades of salt wind. It was in far worse condition than Sarah had described. The wind blew off the open water of the inlet. It cut straight through her thin wool dress and her frayed cardigan. She shivered. Her chest ached deeply where the surgical incision was still healing. She breathed in short, shallow gasps to avoid the sharp pain. She walked toward the leaning structure. Her practical flat shoes sank into the muddy ground with every step. She stopped near a rusted metal barrel in the front yard. She set the cardboard box down on the barrel lid. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out her cell phone. She pressed the side button. The cracked screen lit up and illuminated her wrinkled hands. The battery icon in the top corner showed 14%. The notification center was completely blank. No missed calls. No text messages. The missed calls counter read exactly 0. Her son had not called to see if she made it safely. Her daughter had not texted. The only notification was an automated message from the local pharmacy. It reminded her to pick up a heart medication she could no longer afford. She pressed the power button until the screen went completely black. She slipped the phone back into her right pocket. She reached into the cardboard box. Her fingers brushed past the empty ceramic coffee mug. She picked up the heavy silver monogrammed letter opener. The metal was freezing in the morning air. She gripped the handle tightly in her right hand. Her thumb traced the tarnished initials engraved near the blade. It was the only piece of her father she had left. She looked back down the long dirt driveway. The town was 5 miles away. There was a county assistance office next to the post office. There were women's shelters with warm beds and hot coffee. She could walk back. She could ask strangers for charity. She looked down at the silver letter opener in her hand. She looked up at the rotting wooden walls of the mill. She turned her back to the driveway. The tall marsh grass rustled near the wooden foundation pilings. An old orange tabby cat stepped out from beneath the floorboards. Half of its left ear was missing. Its fur was matted with dried mud and coastal burrs. The cat did not run from her. It walked slowly up the 3 wooden steps to the front porch. It sat directly in front of the swollen, heavy front door. It looked back at Evelyn. Evelyn slipped the silver letter opener into her cardigan pocket. She picked up her cardboard box. She walked up the wooden steps. She pushed her shoulder against the swollen oak door. The wood scraped loudly against the warped floorboards. The orange tabby cat slipped inside first. Evelyn followed it into the damp shadows. The air inside smelled of rotting salt hay and 50 years of undisturbed dust. The ceiling sagged dangerously in the center of the main room. Water stains traced long, dark tracks down the bare wooden walls. She set her cardboard box on a heavily rusted iron work table. Her lower back throbbed with a dull, heavy ache. The surgical incision across her chest pulled sharply with every breath. She ignored the pain and looked around the cavernous space. The massive wooden gears of the old tidal mill sat frozen in the center of the floor. Thick webs hung between the heavy iron cogs. She had no electricity. She had no running water. She began to build a routine to keep from losing her mind. She walked 2 miles to the small town's general store. She spent $12.04 on bottled water and canned beans. She carried the heavy plastic bags back along the dirt road. Her knees popped and burned with every step. Her hands blistered from the thin plastic handles. Back at the mill, she found a heavy canvas sail crumpled in a corner. She dragged it across the floor. She used the heavy silver letter opener to pry rusted nails from a broken wooden pallet. She used a solid river stone to hammer the nails back into the window frame. She pinned the canvas sail over the largest shattered window. It blocked the biting coastal wind. She found an old cast-iron wood stove near the back wall. The iron flue was rusted but completely intact. She spent 3 hours every afternoon gathering driftwood from the muddy estuary bank. Her knuckles bled from snapping dry branches over her knee. She built a small fire inside the iron belly of the stove. The heat was weak, but it was enough to boil water in her ceramic mug. She slept on an old wooden door. She pulled off its broken hinges. She elevated it on 4 stacked cinder blocks to stay off the damp floor. On her 3rd morning, a faded green truck pulled down the dirt driveway. Evelyn watched through the canvas gap in the window. A man with white hair and a worn canvas jacket stepped out. He walked to his tailgate and began unloading split oak logs. Evelyn opened the heavy front door. "I'm Thomas," the man said. He did not look at her ruined wool dress. He did not ask why an elderly woman was living in a condemned mill. "I run the historical society in town," he said. "I was clearing deadfall near the property line. Figured you could use the wood." He carried 3 heavy armfuls of dry oak onto her porch. He set a small box of strike-anywhere matches on top of the pile. He placed a 2-gallon jug of clean water next to the matches. He had a quiet sadness in his eyes. Evelyn recognized it instantly. It was the specific look of someone who had watched a hospital monitor go flat. He didn't wait for a thank you. He got back into his truck and drove away. The storm arrived on her 5th night. It did not come quietly. The wind blew hard off the open ocean and hit the wooden walls. Freezing rain drove horizontally through the gaps in the weathered siding. Evelyn huddled near the cast-iron stove. The fire had died completely hours ago. Water dripped steadily from the sagging ceiling directly onto her thin wool cardigan. Her fingers were entirely numb. Her chest burned with a sharp, terrifying pressure. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her cell phone. She pressed the power button. The battery was dead. The screen remained completely black. David was sleeping in a warm bed bought with her money. Sarah was likely complaining about the rain ruining her weekend plans. Evelyn sat alone in the freezing dark. She thought, "I cannot survive a winter in a broken mill. I am 71 years old and my heart is failing. I cannot fix a leaking roof with $29.12. The cold was settling deep into her bones. She thought about standing up and walking out the front door. She thought about stepping into the freezing water of the estuary. She thought about letting the cold finish what her children had started. This was what dying discarded looked like. A small weight pressed against her thigh. The orange tabby cat crawled under the wet edge of her cardigan. It pressed its warm body against her shivering ribs. It began to purr loudly over the sound of the wind. Evelyn looked down at the muddy, broken creature. It had stayed when everyone else had left. She touched its missing ear with her numb fingers. A sudden, hot anger flared in her chest. She stood up from the cold wooden floor. Her aching knees cracked loudly in the dark. She yelled at the sagging ceiling and the freezing rain. "I am not dying in this damp wood. I am not dying because my children decided I was worthless. I am 71 years old, and I still matter." She grabbed a rusted metal bucket and walked into the rain to catch drinking water. She was still here. The storm broke just before dawn. Pale morning light filtered through the canvas window covering. A sharp, freezing draft cut across the main room. The orange tabby cat sat perfectly still near the center support beam. It stared intently at a warped, water-damaged floorboard. It reached out a paw and scratched at a rusted iron nail. Evelyn knelt beside the cat. Her lower back throbbed with a dull, heavy ache. She felt the freezing air rushing up from the dark water below. She needed to seal the gap to keep the cold out. She reached into her frayed cardigan pocket. She pulled out her father's heavy silver monogrammed letter opener. She wedged the tarnished blade deep into the narrow crack. She gripped the silver handle with both hands and pushed down. The swollen oak board groaned loudly. The rusted nails pulled free with a sharp screech. The thick wooden plank popped upward. Evelyn pulled the heavy board aside. She looked down into the dark cavity between the massive floor joists. The freezing wind hit her face. Resting securely on a crossbeam was a dark green maritime lockbox. It was sealed tight, with a heavy brass latch. Evelyn's hands began to tremble. She reached down into the dark, freezing space. Her fingers closed around the cold metal handle. She pulled the heavy box up onto the warped floorboards. She wiped a thick layer of grey dust from the lid. Her chest tightened sharply. She could not pull a full breath into her lungs. She wedged the tip of the silver letter opener under the brass latch. She twisted the heavy metal handle. The rusted latch snapped open with a sharp click. Evelyn lifted the heavy green lid. The morning sunlight fell directly across a stack of thick legal papers. They were wrapped carefully in clear wax paper. She pulled the bundle out. Her hands shook violently as she unfolded the top document. She read the large typed letters at the top of the page. It was an original property deed. She stared at the text in total confusion. She read the first paragraph twice. The legal language made no sense at first. She looked closer at the thick blue ink of the notary seals. She read the second page very slowly. The trembling in her hands moved up into her shoulders. She saw her father's signature at the bottom of the page. She saw the words irrevocable, generation, skipping, trust. She saw her own full legal name, listed as the sole lifetime beneficiary. She turned to the third page. She read the address of the large colonial house her children had sold. The document stated the primary estate could never be sold or transferred. It required her physical signature on this exact original deed. The medical power of attorney her children used was legally void. The real estate transaction was entirely fraudulent. David and Sarah never owned the property. They never had the legal right to sell her home. Evelyn stared at the yellowed paper. She read the final paragraph a third time. The full scale of the document finally registered in her mind. She traced her father's signature with her calloused thumb. She looked at the silver letter opener resting on the floorboards. She looked at the muddy cat sitting quietly beside her. "You knew," she whispered to the empty room. "You protected me." She folded the heavy papers carefully. It was enough. She put the wax paper bundle into her thin cardboard box. She walked the 5 miles back into town. She went directly to the county archives building. Thomas was sitting behind a large oak desk in the back room. He looked up when she walked through the heavy glass doors. She placed the folded original deed on his desk. He put on his reading glasses and studied the notary seals. He did not speak for a long time. He took her across the street to the local community bank. He introduced her to the branch manager. The manager examined the irrevocable trust documents and the generation skipping clauses. He confirmed the legal weight of her father's signature. He authorized a small restorative loan against the undisputed estate value. Evelyn walked out of the bank with a cashier's check. She bought proper leather work boots, a heavy canvas coat, and solid tools. She hired 2 local carpenters to stabilize the mill's failing foundation. The physical transformation began the very next morning. Evelyn did not sit in a chair and watch the men work. She worked alongside the 2 local carpenters every single day. The sagging roof was stripped down to the bare rafters. They replaced the rotting wood with thick, salvaged cedar planks. She walked down to the estuary every morning at low tide. She gathered smooth, flat river stones exposed by the receding water. She carried them back to the mill in a heavy metal bucket. She mixed mortar in a plastic trough using a steel hoe. She built a wide, solid stone hearth against the interior wall. She placed each heavy stone by hand. Her hands grew thick with permanent calluses. Her fingernails were stained with dark earth and wood sap. The pain in her chest faded completely as her muscles grew stronger. The canvas sail was removed from the shattered front window. It was replaced with thick, clear panes of tempered glass. The freezing drafts were sealed permanently with solid oak trim. She spent weeks sanding the massive wooden gears in the center of the room. She used her father's silver letter opener to scrape away decades of hardened grease. She oiled the heavy iron cogs until they turned silently by hand. When the loan money ran low, she bartered for materials. Thomas introduced her to a retired shipwright down the coast. The shipwright had a barn full of old mahogany decking. Evelyn traded her father's antique brass drafting table from the mill's attic. She hauled the heavy mahogany planks back in Thomas's faded green truck. She laid a solid, weatherproof deck across the back of the mill over the water. The massive water wheel outside was completely seized with rust. She hung suspended in a rope harness over the freezing water for 4 days. She scrubbed the heavy iron brackets with a wire brush. She applied thick black marine grease to the metal joints. She pushed against the wooden paddles with all her weight. The wheel groaned loudly and broke free from 40 years of rust. It turned slowly in the rising tidal current. Before, the mill had been a silent, rotting grave. Now, it hummed with the steady, rhythmic energy of the moving water. The interior walls were lined with smooth pine beadboard. She painted the wood a crisp, clean white to catch the natural light. The moment the property became genuinely beautiful happened in late autumn. Evelyn was sweeping the new mahogany floorboards. The late afternoon sun dropped below the heavy cloud cover. Long bands of golden light poured through the thick glass windows. The light hit the polished iron gears and threw warm patterns across the entire room. The massive water wheel turned steadily outside. It sent a deep, comforting vibration through the solid floorboards. The room was warm, perfectly dry, and filled with bright light. The orange cat was asleep on a thick rug near the burning stone hearth. Evelyn stopped sweeping and leaned against the wooden handle of the broom. She watched the dust motes float in the golden light. She was the builder now. The thin cardboard box from the hospital sat in the corner of the room for 3 months. It held the memory of the sterile room and the rhythmic beeping monitors. Evelyn picked it up on a Tuesday morning. She did not pack it away in the dusty attic. She tore the stiff cardboard into long, jagged strips. She opened the heavy iron door of the wood stove. She fed the cardboard strips directly into the bright orange coals. She watched the flames consume the name of the hospital printed on the side. She stood up and brushed the grey ash from her calloused hands. She walked to the open front door and looked out at the moving water. She spoke quietly into the cold salt wind. "You were right about this place, Dad," she said. "It just needed a little time." She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. The sharp, terrifying pressure in her chest was completely gone. Her lungs filled with the heavy, damp, coastal air without any sharp pain. Her shoulders dropped a full inch. The constant, rigid tightness in her jaw finally released. She drank her black coffee and watched the tide pull away from the mudflats. She woke at 5 o'clock every morning after that. She did not use an alarm clock. The sound of the changing tide moving through the wooden pilings woke her naturally. She put on her heavy canvas coat and her leather work boots. She walked the perimeter of the property to check the exterior siding. Her knees still ached in the damp coastal mornings. She ignored the ache. She carried 3 heavy oak logs to the stove before boiling her water. She did not put up a sign by the dirt road. She did not post photographs of the restored water wheel anywhere. The community found her anyway. It started with Thomas. He drove his faded green truck down the dirt driveway on a Sunday afternoon. He did not bring firewood this time. He brought a worn leather satchel and a steel thermos of black tea. He sat on the new mahogany deck and watched the massive water wheel turn. He told Evelyn about the day his wife's heart stopped. He described the heavy silence of his empty house. Evelyn did not offer hollow, rehearsed comfort. She poured him a cup of hot water and let him speak without interruption. 2 weeks later, the woman from the local general store arrived. Her name was Margaret. She carried a glass jar of preserved lemons and a fresh loaf of sourdough bread. Margaret's husband had left her for a younger woman 10 years ago. She had spent a decade walking through the small town completely alone. Evelyn set an extra ceramic mug on the heavy iron work table. She sliced the warm bread with a heavy steel knife. They sat by the stone hearth and listened to the burning oak logs pop. Margaret brought a small wooden loom the following afternoon. She set it up in the corner near the tempered glass window. Evelyn cleared a wide space on the iron work table for Margaret's colourful yarns. They worked in total silence for hours. The only sound in the room was the clacking of the wooden shuttle. By spring, the dirt driveway saw a steady, quiet stream of visitors. A retired carpenter named Henry came to help oil the massive iron gears. He stayed for 4 hours just to listen to the rhythmic hum of the machinery. He brought a set of antique chisels wrapped in an oiled leather roll. He showed Evelyn how to sharpen the steel blades on a wet whetstone. He didn't take the tools back when he walked to his truck. He left them neatly aligned on her wooden workbench. Evelyn used the sharp chisels to carve her father's initials into the heavy oak doorframe. She traced the deep wooden letters with her thumb. A young mother who had just lost her job brought her 2 quiet children. Evelyn taught the children how to skip flat river stones across the estuary water. Nobody asked Evelyn for money. Nobody treated her like a fragile, elderly patient recovering from surgery. Nobody spoke to her with the slow, loud voice people use for the dying. They brought salvage wood, rusted nails, and fresh vegetables from their garden patches. Evelyn provided the warm fire, the strong coffee, and the quiet space. The people who came down the dirt driveway had all lost something. They sat on the mahogany deck in worn canvas jackets and heavy wool sweaters. They watched the grey coastal birds dive into the dark water. Evelyn no longer checked her cell phone for missed calls from David or Sarah. She left the device plugged into a wall outlet in the back room. The battery remained fully charged. The screen remained entirely blank. She was busy measuring a new canvas sail for the high loft window. Her hands were strong and stained with dark wood oil. She was complete. The black luxury SUV turned off the paved coastal highway onto the crushed shell driveway. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late April. The heavy suspension of the vehicle bounced violently in the deep mud ruts. Evelyn was standing on the new mahogany deck. She was securing a thick hemp rope to a polished iron cleat. She heard the heavy tires crushing the dry white shells. She did not stop her work. She pulled the rough rope tight and tied a perfect nautical knot. The SUV stopped near the edge of the tall marsh grass. The driver's side door opened. David stepped out onto the damp ground. He wore a tailored charcoal suit and polished leather shoes. The wet coastal mud instantly coated the edges of his expensive soles. Sarah climbed out of the passenger side. She was holding a thick manila folder tight against her chest. They both stopped entirely still. They stared at the massive iron water wheel turning steadily in the current. They looked at the solid stone chimney rising above the new cedar roof. They looked at the clean white beadboard shining through the tempered glass windows. They had expected to find a rotting ruin and a broken woman. Instead, they found a fully restored maritime sanctuary. David adjusted his silk tie. He walked toward the mahogany deck. His polished shoes left deep, wet tracks on the clean wooden stairs. "Mom," he said. His voice was loud over the rushing sound of the estuary water. He forced a wide, tight smile. "We've been so worried about you." He used the exact same caring language he had used in the sterile hospital room. Sarah hurried up the stairs behind him. "You shouldn't be out here working," Sarah said. "At your age, you can't manage this kind of physical labor. We're just being realistic." Evelyn turned away from the iron cleat. She wiped her calloused hands on the heavy canvas of her coat. She looked directly at her son's luxury watch. She looked at her daughter's designer handbag. She did not invite them inside the warm mill. She did not offer them black coffee in ceramic mugs. She stood perfectly still on the wooden deck. The orange tabby cat walked out through the open door and sat beside her leather boots. "The escrow account is frozen." "Mum," David said. His forced smile dropped completely. His voice grew thin and urgent. The title company flagged the sale of the colonial house. Sarah stepped forward and held out the manila folder. "They're demanding an original signature from the Generation Skipping Trust," Sarah said. "We need you to sign this waiver today, so the buyer's funds will clear." "Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Mum," David added. "This is what's best for everyone." Evelyn looked at the crisp, white paper in Sarah's hand. She remembered the $41.16 in her worn leather wallet. She remembered the freezing rain leaking onto her face in the dark. She remembered the moment she seriously considered letting the cold finish her. She felt the heavy silver monogrammed letter opener resting in her deep coat pocket. She did not raise her voice. She did not demand an apology. She spoke with complete, devastating calm. "You used a medical power of attorney while I was unconscious," Evelyn said. Her voice was flat and precise. "You sold a house you did not own." David blinked rapidly. "Mom, we were just being practical. Dad would have wanted this. Your father secured the true deed in a maritime lockbox under this floor," Evelyn said. She pointed to the solid mahogany boards beneath their feet. "He legally blocked you from ever selling the main estate." Sarah's hands began to shake. The manila folder rattled against the large buttons of her expensive wool coat. "You're not getting nothing," Sarah said. "It was a total slip of the mask. You're getting this property. You have a house now. Just sign the waiver." Evelyn looked at her daughter. "I am not getting this property," Evelyn said quietly. "I built this property." She stepped closer to the edge of the wooden stairs. "You gave me this rotting mill because you thought it was legally worthless. Because you thought I was worthless." She paused. and let the sound of the rushing water fill the heavy silence. "You were wrong about both." Evelyn turned her back on her two children. She walked toward the heavy oak door of the mill. "The bank's attorneys will contact you regarding the fraud," she said over her shoulder. She stepped inside the warm, bright room. The heavy wooden door clicked shut. Through the thick, tempered glass, Evelyn watched the black luxury SUV struggle to turn around. The heavy tires spun uselessly in the damp coastal mud. David threw his hands up behind the steering wheel in visible frustration. Sarah sat frozen in the passenger seat, clutching her manila folder. The vehicle finally caught traction and sped back down the crushed shell driveway. Evelyn did not watch them disappear around the bend. She walked back to her heavy iron work table. She picked up her cell phone from beside the wall outlet. She unplugged the black charging cord. She dialed the direct number for the community bank manager. He answered on the second ring. Evelyn told him about the forged medical power of attorney. She described the specific legal waiver Sarah had tried to force her to sign. The bank manager asked for her explicit permission to contact the state authorities. Evelyn gave it without hesitation. The legal machinery began moving that same afternoon. The title company formally froze all of David and Sarah's financial assets. The escrow account holding the proceeds from the colonial house was locked by court order. A county sheriff arrived at David's logistics company 3 days later. He carried a thick stack of blue legal folders. He handed David a formal summons for real estate fraud and elder exploitation. David's employees watched quietly from the main warehouse floor. He did not adjust his expensive silk tie. He looked down at the blue folders in total silence. Sarah received her summons in the driveway of her own home. She dropped her designer handbag onto the hard concrete. She did not pick it up. At the tidal mill, the air remained completely calm. Evelyn did not attend the preliminary legal hearings in the city. She signed the required state affidavits in the quiet back room of the town archives. Thomas sat across the large oak desk while she signed her name. He stamped the papers with his heavy brass notary seal. The loud click of the metal stamp echoed in the quiet room. "They called the archives this morning," Thomas said. He carefully stacked the signed legal affidavits. "Your son asked if I could convince you to drop the fraud charges." Evelyn looked at the dark blue ink of her signature. She placed the heavy silver monogrammed letter opener back into her cardigan pocket. "What did you tell him?" she asked. "I told him I just managed the history here," Thomas said. He slid the legal file into a thick cardboard envelope. "I told him his history was already written." Evelyn nodded once. She stood up and walked out of the building into the bright afternoon sun. She kept walking. She walked the 5 miles back to the estuary. The spring air was losing its sharp, damp chill. Wild coastal grass was pushing up through the muddy banks along the dirt road. She stopped at the local general store before leaving the town limits. Margaret was sweeping the wide wooden porch with a straw broom. Margaret did not mention the sheriff's cars she had seen heading toward the city. She handed Evelyn a brown paper bag containing fresh coffee beans. She refused to take Evelyn's money. Evelyn placed 2 crisp dollar bills on the wooden counter anyway. She walked down the long dirt driveway toward the open water. The mill stood tall against the gray coastal sky. The massive wooden wheel turned steadily, churning the dark water into white foam. She spent the afternoon building a solid cedar planter box on the mahogany deck. She measured the thick boards with a rusted steel square. She drove heavy galvanized screws into the wood using a manual hand drill. Her calloused hands moved with practiced, steady rhythm. She filled the wooden box with dark, rich soil she had hauled from the forest edge. She planted small green herbs in straight, careful rows. She watered the dark soil from her heavy rusted metal bucket. The orange tabby cat slept on the warm wooden planks beside her boots. The legal process moved slowly over the next several weeks. The bank manager called her twice a week with factual updates. The fraudulent buyers of the colonial house had voided the sale completely. The state took formal possession of the empty estate, pending the criminal trial. David's logistics company lost its primary shipping contracts after the indictment became public. Sarah's husband moved into a rented apartment across the city. He took the expensive designer furniture they had purchased with Evelyn's retirement money. Evelyn heard these updates through the small speaker of her cell phone. She stood on her mahogany deck and watched the gray seagulls circle the water. She felt no triumph. She felt no desire for revenge. She felt only the deep, quiet weight of a closed door. Her chest did not tighten when she heard their names. Her lower back ached from the heavy gardening work, but it was a good ache. It was the ache of a body building a life, not a body waiting to die. She used her father's heavy silver letter opener to slice open the final legal letter. It arrived in a thick brown envelope with a raised state seal. The document formally restored her name as the sole legal owner of the colonial estate. It returned the remaining stolen funds directly to her secure bank account. She read the final judgment while standing near the warm cast-iron stove. She folded the crisp paper and placed it in her thin cardboard box. She did not call David. She did not text Sarah. She poured herself a cup of black coffee. She walked out to the deck and watched the tide come in. It was enough. Evelyn did not drive back to the large colonial house in the city. She held the crisp legal deed, restoring her absolute ownership. She laid the heavy paper flat on her iron work table. She did not frame the formal judgment. She did not call a moving company to retrieve her stolen antique furniture. She picked up her father's heavy silver monogrammed letter opener. She used the tarnished blade to slice a clean line across the bottom of a blank envelope. She folded the original deed and slid it inside the thick paper. She wrote the address of a local real estate broker on the front. She walked down the crushed shell driveway and placed the envelope into the rusted metal mailbox. She raised the red metal flag. She walked back toward the turning water wheel. She stopped at the edge of the tall marsh grass. She looked down at the dark estuary water moving against the wooden pilings. She spoke to her late husband for the first and last time since his funeral. "I ran your billing department for 30 years, Arthur," she said to the open water. "I managed your ledger without a salary." She pulled her heavy canvas coat tighter against the wind. "I am closing the account." The constant, dull ringing in her ears finally stopped. The rigid tension at the base of her skull dissolved completely. She felt the solid, warm earth beneath her leather work boots. She breathed in the heavy scent of crushed pine needles and wet coastal salt. She was not a discarded widow. She was not a victim of a fraudulent sale. She was a woman who knew how to build a fire from wet wood. The real estate broker sold the colonial house to a young family 3 weeks later. Evelyn took the massive wire transfer and drove to the community bank. She sat across from the bank manager at his polished oak desk. She did not transfer the funds into her personal checking account. She established a permanent conservation trust for the entire coastal estuary. She legally protected the marshland from any future commercial development. She named Thomas and Margaret as the primary co-trustees. She walked out of the glass doors and felt the bright morning sun on her face. The tidal mill became a quiet anchor at the end of the dirt road. The orange tabby cat slept under the warmth of the cast-iron wood stove. Margaret arrived every Tuesday morning with fresh sourdough bread. She sat at the heavy iron work table and kneaded dough on the polished metal. She never asked Evelyn about the criminal trial in the city. She only asked her to pass the coarse sea salt. Henry, the retired carpenter, brought a truckload of salvaged cedar planks. He did not offer to build the new wraparound deck for her. He handed Evelyn a heavy steel hammer and a canvas pouch of galvanized nails. They worked side by side in the damp coastal air. They matched each other's steady, rhythmic strikes against the wood. Thomas arrived on Thursday evenings with his worn leather satchel. He brought heavy books bound in dark green cloth from the historical archives. He read aloud about the original maritime routes of the estuary. Evelyn poured hot black tea from a dented steel thermos. She passed a ceramic mug to Thomas. She passed a mug to Margaret. She passed a mug to Henry. They sat in a wide circle around the burning stone hearth. They did not talk about their empty houses. They did not talk about the people who had left them behind. They talked about the changing tide. They talked about the best angle to sharpen a steel chisel. They talked about the migratory patterns of the grey coastal birds. The massive wooden cogs turned silently in the center of the room. The tempered glass windows held back the freezing coastal wind. The white beadboard walls glowed warmly in the firelight. The space was completely clear of anything she did not choose herself. There were no antique armchairs purchased to impress her son's business partners. There were no silver tea sets polished for her daughter's social gatherings. There was only the solid wood, the heavy iron, and the moving water. Evelyn looked at the faces illuminated by the orange firelight. She saw hands stained with dark soil and thick grease. She saw calloused thumbs holding cracked ceramic mugs. She recognized the exact quiet strength in the room. It was the strength of things that had been broken and rebuilt by hand. She did not owe these people anything. They did not owe her anything. They simply shared the warmth of the fire. She sat back in her wooden chair. Sarah returned to the crushed shell driveway in late October. She did not drive the black luxury SUV. She walked the 5 miles from the county bus stop in town. She wore a faded grey sweatshirt and scuffed canvas sneakers. She did not walk up the wooden stairs to the mahogany deck. She carried a cardboard box of heavy black trash bags. She started at the edge of the county road marker. She bent down and picked up shattered glass bottles from the tall marsh grass. She dragged rusted iron car parts out of the dark mudflats. She worked until the sun dropped below the tree line. She did not knock on the heavy oak door. She walked the 5 miles back to the bus stop in the dark. She returned the next Tuesday. She returned the Tuesday after that. She cleared 2 miles of the overgrown coastal shoulder entirely by hand. Her manicured fingernails broke and filled with dark estuary mud. Evelyn watched her daughter from the tempered glass window. She saw Sarah flinch when the sharp marsh reeds cut her bare hands. She saw Sarah wipe her face and keep pulling debris from the water. She saw the specific, sustained action of genuine remorse. On the 4th Tuesday, the freezing coastal rain returned. Sarah knelt in the mud, pulling a heavy waterlogged tire from the reeds. Her grey sweatshirt was completely soaked and heavy with freezing water. Evelyn put on her canvas coat and stepped out onto the deck. She walked down the wet wooden stairs to the dirt driveway. She stood 10 feet away from her daughter. Sarah stopped pulling on the heavy rubber tire. She looked up at Evelyn through the driving rain. She did not ask for forgiveness. She did not explain about the divorce or the frozen bank accounts. She did not offer a dramatic, tearful apology. She just shivered in the freezing rain and waited. Evelyn reached into her deep coat pocket. She pulled out a pair of heavy, insulated leatherwork gloves. She tossed the gloves onto the wet grass next to the tire. "That tire is too heavy for bare hands," Evelyn said. Her voice was calm and completely steady over the wind. She pointed toward the warm, glowing windows of the mill. "There is a wire brush on the iron work table inside." She looked at her daughter's muddy, bleeding fingers. "The gears need to be scrubbed before they rust again. You can earn a cup of coffee." Evelyn turned and walked back toward the mahogany deck. She walked up the stairs and stepped into the warm room. She did not look back to see if Sarah picked up the gloves. She simply left the heavy oak door open. A few minutes later, wet canvas sneakers stepped quietly onto the wooden floorboards. It was enough. 1 year after the morning she arrived in the freezing rain. The tide was high in the coastal estuary. The dark salt water rushed smoothly through the heavy wooden pilings. The massive oak water wheel turned with a steady, deep rhythm. The water fell from the wooden paddles in thick white sheets. Evelyn stood at the polished iron work table in the center of the room. She wore a clean white linen shirt and her thick canvas trousers. Her leather work boots rested firmly on the warm mahogany floorboards. The orange tabby cat slept in a wide square of morning sunlight. Its missing ear twitched gently as it dreamed. Evelyn struck a long wooden match against a flat river stone. She lit the dry kindling inside the cast-iron wood stove. She watched the bright orange flames catch the rough edge of the oak logs. She poured boiling water from a heavy black kettle. She filled 3 ceramic mugs with dark roast coffee. She carried 1 mug to the tempered glass window. Sarah was outside on the new wraparound wooden deck. She wore her faded grey sweatshirt and thick leather work gloves. She was sanding a long reclaimed cedar bench. Her hands and forearms were covered in pale wood dust. She did not look up from her steady work. She followed the grain of the wood with a slow, even rhythm. David had never driven down the crushed shell driveway again. The state court had finalized his prison sentence in early September. He was serving 3 years in a minimum security facility for real estate fraud. Evelyn had not attended the final sentencing hearing in the city. She had been busy installing a new solid brass latch on the front door. She set the second ceramic mug on the iron work table. Thomas pulled his faded green truck up to the edge of the tall marsh grass. He walked up the wooden stairs carrying a small stack of mail. He left the white envelopes on the corner of the work table. He picked up the third ceramic mug. He walked out to the sunlit deck to help Sarah with the cedar bench. They worked together in complete, comfortable silence. Evelyn looked at the top envelope on the stack. It bore the raised blue seal of the County Conservation Trust. She reached into the front pocket of her linen shirt. She pulled out her father's heavy silver monogrammed letter opener. The metal was no longer tarnished black. She had spent 3 hours polishing the deep engraved initials with steel wool. The silver shone brightly in the morning sunlight. She slipped the clean metal blade under the flap of the envelope. She sliced the heavy paper with one smooth, effortless motion. The legal document inside confirmed the permanent preservation of the estuary. The state had formally locked the land deed into the trust. No luxury condominiums would ever be built on the coastal mudflats. No commercial developers would ever pave over the crushed white shells. The tall marsh grass would grow wild and undisturbed forever. Evelyn folded the crisp white paper. She placed it flat on the polished iron work table. She laid the silver letter opener precisely in the center of the document. Its heavy weight held the paper perfectly flat against the coastal breeze coming through the window. It was exactly where it belonged. It would never need to pry open a hidden floorboard again. It would never need to be a weapon against the freezing dark. It was just a beautiful piece of silver resting on a finished desk. Evelyn looked around the bright, warm room. The white pine beadboard walls caught the light from the open water. The solid stone hearth radiated a steady, even heat. The massive iron gears hummed a quiet, endless song beneath the floorboards. The air smelled of fresh coffee and clean coastal wind. She walked over to the heavy oak doorframe. She looked at the initials she had carved into the wood with Henry's sharp chisel. She placed her calloused right hand over the deep wooden letters. "The foundation is solid, Dad," she said to the empty air. She picked up her ceramic mug from the window ledge. She walked out onto the wooden deck to drink her coffee in the sun. She did not look back at the dirt road. Evelyn Hayes did not reclaim her life in a crowded courtroom. She did not pound her fists on a polished mahogany table. She did not demand a dramatic apology from the children who threw her away. She reclaimed her life in the quiet, steady rhythm of a turning oak water wheel. She proved that the ultimate defense against betrayal is not revenge. The ultimate defense is building a life so complete that the betrayers simply cease to matter. David and Sarah believed that power existed strictly in bank accounts. They believed it existed in forged medical documents and stolen signatures. They believed they could strip a 71-year-old woman of her history. They thought they could leave her with nothing but a rusty iron key. They were blinded by their own relentless greed. They did not understand that a woman who spent 40 years holding a family together knows exactly how to rebuild a broken foundation. They handed her a rotting tidal mill because they thought she would quietly break under its collapsed roof. Instead, she used their discarded ruins to build an absolute fortress. She traded the sterile walls of a stolen colonial estate for the heavy, honest timber of the coastal estuary. The people who came down the dirt driveway did not come for her money. They came because she had built a genuine sanctuary out of pure survival. Justice is rarely a sudden, blinding lightning strike. True justice is the slow, undeniable rising of the coastal tide. It washes away the fragile, hollow structures built entirely on lies. It leaves behind only what is solid, what is genuine, and what is earned through calloused hands. If Evelyn's story moved you, if you've ever had your decades of quiet sacrifice completely erased by the people you protected, if you've ever been handed the broken remnants of your own life and told to be grateful for the scraps, leave one word in the comments describing the moment Evelyn wedged that silver letter opener under the heavy brass latch. Because Evelyn's story proves something that is always true. Greed will always underestimate the dangerous, quiet strength of a woman who has survived the worst they could do. Share this with someone who needs to remember that the pieces others throw away are the exact materials required to build a new life, because together we prove that dreams don't age.